right. As an active practitioner in a very narrow area, I'm probably going to be a little more granular than a lot of other speakers here, but I want to talk about the hedge fund industry, which I think is probably more controversial than the private equity industry, and the types of regulation that we've had and what have made sense and what's been proposed and what makes sense there. Let me first say, hedge funds have actually done quite well in the current crisis, if by quite well you mean down 25% last year. But that was a comparatively heroic performance, I think, all things considered. And most of them have earned about half of that money back. And some of our clients by now are, up above water again. So in terms of actual losses of money in this sector, really not so bad. And there are net capital inflows again already. Investors no longer so unhappy. And of course, in this industry, managers are quite aligned with their investors in terms of performance. What they actually get paid is a slice of the performance in the fund, and they have to make up prior losses before they get it. There's a management fee, but this profit component, which is significant, is actually linked to how the fund does in the long term. And managers tend to leave a lot of money in those funds. In fact, they used to leave even more in there before the repeal of deferral rules on the tax side. But in any case, you have a real alignment of the principals and the investors. And you've got sophisticated investors. Here's an industry where you, generally speaking, can't come in unless you have $5 million of investable assets, which excludes your house and other valuable things like your shoe collection, or maybe I personalized. But in any case, and you have an industry where mostly American managers actually are investing, and they're attracting a lot of foreign capital into U.S. businesses. So you would think this would be fairly attractive, and yet often there is a certain amount of suspicion about this industry. And interestingly, I think regulation is partially the cause of that, and in particular, regulation that says if I'm going to privately place fund interests, I shouldn't be able to discuss those funds publicly. Now, why not? I understand why I shouldn't be able to sell to somebody who's not qualified to invest, but would it really be a bad thing for a fund manager engaged in an active offering to be able to appear in the newspaper and explain what their fund is doing? That should be accurate, obviously, unbiased, one hopes, but why would it be a bad thing for the public to know what funds are doing? Often there are unflattering articles written about funds, and my clients call and say, can I do something about that? And I say, well, unfortunately, no, because you're offering. I'm not sure we're really serving anyone with that particular method. There obviously are a lot of rules out there that apply to funds. And I think part of the confusion about funds as unregulated is these rules don't say attention hedge funds. They're attention market participants. And that makes sense because hedge funds really just are market participants. So insider trading, market manipulation, fraud, accurate offering materials, proxy rules, all these types of rules, which I would hardly advocate should be repealed, do apply to hedge funds just as they'd apply to anybody else participating in these markets. But there are some rules that specifically apply to hedge funds, and some of them have worked, and some of them have created problems. The thing that is being proposed right now that I think is more or less inevitable is that all hedge fund managers should register. And we sort of had an interesting history with that because hedge fund managers did largely have to register briefly, and then that was declared actually to be an unacceptable rule, that it was a violation of congressional authority. It was overturned, and now new rules are coming up that will again register these managers. And the theory is that'll give the government more transparency into the industry. And maybe that's not a bad thing. I don't think there's huge resistance, but I think you have to be realistic about what the registration process is going to do. The registration process means that at some point, a few 26-year-olds show up in your office and try to figure out how you're doing. And nothing against 26-year-olds, but there are limits to what you're going to find during that process. For example, I had a client who was audited, and one of those inspectors came in and said, my God, you're selling securities you don't own. Well, that's called shorting, and it's not really so surprising. On the other hand, Madoff, for instance, was registered as a broker-dealer and extensively audited. And by the way, he didn't even pretend to be a hedge fund, so he's not our fault. But he was registered, and that really did not cause anyone to uncover his frauds, despite various letters and so forth suggesting that they might exist. Obviously, the galleon insider trading scandal and the things rippling out from there have been uncovered, but is that through the inspection process or through other activities? And certainly the rules about insider trading exist. It's not that we need to reform them to find those particular abuses if they are happening. Other examples. What happened with Lehman Brothers? It was kind of fascinating to suddenly learn that the UK didn't have a bankruptcy code. I think that was a rude awakening to a lot of funds who had custodied their assets there. But why their assets were there and will be there for the next 10 years while this thing gets sorted out is because they were seeking non-Reg T leverage, because we had a notion post the last depression that we should basically be limiting leverage to a sort of 50% test. And a lot of people wanted more leverage than that for their programs, and they went and sought it in these other ways, using offshore prime brokerage accounts. I had a prime broker recently saying, do you think there's a future for enhanced prime brokerage? And I said to them, do you mean prime brokerage plus solvency? So clearly, leverage is a systemic risk. I'm not going to deny that. But in the course of trying to solve it, we actually created another problem that we didn't totally anticipate. Similarly, derivatives. There's now a proposal to have all derivatives, or at least most of them, traded on exchanges. And I think there is an argument for the greater transparency of knowing what level of actual trading is happening in the market, and there's something a little spooky about thinking there's a shadow market out there that we have no idea of the size or contours of. But there's a price to that, because derivatives are very customized instruments, and you can't just fill in 4 or 5 fields in an exchange-traded instrument and necessarily get what you want. Same thing I would say about securitization. It seems like a problem now, but on the other hand, securitization for a long time was a way that we got useful loans to small businesses. It's a way that we got loans to homeowners, and maybe some of those people had no business to be borrowing. But even the ones who were going to be able to pay it back, it's a lot harder to convince somebody to make a loan to you individually than to convince somebody to buy a slice of 1,000 loans that they can statistically predict the outcome of. I joked with one of my clients that basically at this point I feel like I go to the vending machine in my office and all I see are little packets of flour and sugar, and I kind of keep wishing somebody would put them back together. That is going to need to happen, again, in some form. I don't think we can suddenly move away from that sort of financial packaging just because it sometimes fails. And by the way, I think sometimes market participants learn these lessons faster than regulators do. So sometimes we're plugging the hole on yesterday's problems. I don't have the problem right now of a lot of funds wanting huge amounts of leverage or seeking to buy CDOs. So yes, it was unfortunate what happened, but they have already learned and moved on. Short selling, another topic I wanted to cover. Short selling sometimes feels un-American. Here you are saying some of these companies are bad. But there are several other sides to it. First of all, most hedge funds, even the so-called long-short ones, are net long. Why? Because markets usually, in general, except recently, go up. So with that in mind, your typical hedge fund is mostly long, mostly buying securities of companies and investing in them. The short is a way of hedging against that activity. But it also incentivizes sophisticated market players to investigate those companies. Enron, for example, was partly uncovered from one of my clients who was on an analyst call challenging the Enron comments. That wouldn't have happened if the only thing that client could have done was buy Enron long. That client clearly didn't think Enron was a long play. So why were they there? To figure out how much of a short play it should be? That's not necessarily a bad thing. And in the most recent crisis, obviously having a short freeze on the short selling of financial stocks created some stability in those stocks. What it did to the long-term perception of the safety of those stocks, I don't know. Memories are perhaps short. But certainly the idea of disclosing shorts and disclosing the identity of the companies that you're shorting, it's really, in a sense, a blackmail against those managers, because realistically, if you have to disclose who you're shorting against, you're not going to get information from those companies anymore. So realistically, it becomes a lot harder to perform what I think is a useful market function. Compensation of managers and net capital requirements. It's true. Hedge fund managers are rich. They make 2% management fees, 20% performance fees, and when you begin to amass $20, $30 billion of assets, that can definitely add up. On the other hand, the investors investing in these funds go into them knowingly. It's not as if anyone is unaware of that compensation and doesn't choose to pay it. And there really is a differential in performance of qualified managers. So I don't think it's a foolish errand that these investors are on. Net capital requirements. Well, funds don't have depositors. So why do funds suddenly get threatened with regulation that would have them hold on to minimum net capital? Who are we protecting? These qualified purchasers? Not really necessary, I think. And in fact, the fact that funds are relatively unregulated, don't have to preserve their capital, aren't worried about being taken over, aren't worried about TARP, is actually enabling them to be lenders at a time when other people cannot be lenders. And that's been a stabilizing force. And I think, in fact, Funds would lend more if it weren't for a tax rule called ECI, effectively connected income, which basically causes it to be disadvantaged for foreign and tax-exempt investors coming through foreign funds to invest in debt in U.S. industries. And that is unfortunate because obviously there are a lot of people who've needed loans at the moment, and it has not been possible for the hedge fund industry to provide them. And similarly, in the distressed fund context, when you are investing in distressed loans and trying to restructure them, those same issues present themselves. I think there would actually be more capital if we could free some of that up. So, in short, I think that there is regulation already in this industry, more than people appreciate, on the various market manipulative practices, insider trading, and so forth that you might legitimately fear. On the other hand, I don't think that some of the regulation that is being proposed now is going to be helpful. And I think attempts to standardize this industry by people who are fairly far removed from it are not going to achieve the results that the free market in this space is likely to achieve. Thank you.